You should clean the toilets, not meddle in my business.
Your business is corruption, and it ends tonight.
This merger is a disaster. You lied to all of us.
The evidence is right here. It was never a billion-dollar deal.
We can explain the discrepancies.
If she hadn't spoken up, the billionaire would have signed away his entire company in less than 60 seconds. The words would spread through Caldwell Holdings by sunrise, whispered between elevators, coffee stations, and marble hallways like office folklore. But at 7:42 p.m. on a stormy Thursday night in downtown Chicago, none of that had happened yet. At that moment, Maya Brooks was still just the Blackmaid pushing a quiet gray cleaning cart across the 32nd floor while executives in $1,000 suits rushed past her without making eye contact. Rain tapped softly against the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Lake Michigan, turning the skyline into a blur of silver lights and dark glass. Inside the executive boardroom, tension hung thick in the air. The merger deal between Caldwell Holdings and Vance Capital was only minutes away from being finalized, and every attorney, analyst, and board member inside the room looked exhausted. Ethan Caldwell stood at the head of the massive walnut conference table, one hand braced against the leather chair beside him, the other flipping through the final contract draft with sharp, impatient movements. At 46 years old, Ethan carried the kind of presence that made entire rooms stiffen when he walked in. Tall, controlled, perfectly dressed, with cold blue eyes that rarely softened, he had spent 2 decades building Caldwell Holdings into one of the largest logistics empires in the Midwest. People admired him, people feared him, and lately, after a string of public betrayals from former executives, Ethan trusted almost no one, especially not people beneath his world. "We signed tonight," he said flatly, not looking up from the contract. "I'm done dragging this deal through legal hell." Around him, tired nods circled the room. Outside the boardroom doors, Maya quietly wiped fingerprints from the glass panels while balancing a tray of untouched coffee cups against her hip. She moved carefully, almost invisibly, the way service workers in luxury buildings learn to move after years of being ignored. Her navy housekeeping uniform was slightly faded at the sleeves, and the soles of her black sneakers squeaked softly against the polished floor. Most nights, nobody noticed her. That was fine with Maya. Invisible people survived longer. But as she reached for the door handle, her eyes drifted toward the open contract resting near the edge of the conference table. Just one glance. That was all it took. Her breath caught instantly. A single clause buried deep inside the merger agreement flashed across the page like a warning siren in her mind. She stopped moving. The room around her faded beneath the pounding in her chest. No, that couldn't be right. Maya stepped closer to the glass without realizing it, staring harder at the wording. The language looked harmless at first. Technical, dense, easy to miss. But she understood exactly what it meant. The liability transfer clause didn't just expose Caldwell Holdings financially. It quietly surrendered majority operational control after the merger finalized. Whoever wrote it had disguised the takeover beneath legal phrasing designed to exhaust readers into skipping details. Her fingers tightened around the coffee tray. Someone inside that room was about to destroy Ethan Caldwell's company, and nobody had noticed. Inside, Ethan uncapped his pen. "Let's finish this." Maya's pulse hammered in her ears. Every instinct told her to walk away. She was housekeeping, a maid, a black woman already struggling to keep a job that barely covered her mother's dialysis treatments on the South Side. People like her didn't interrupt billionaire board meetings. People like her got escorted out for speaking out of turn. She knew that. God, she knew that. But the clause kept burning in her mind like fire. Before she could stop herself, Maya pushed the boardroom door open. The room immediately froze. 20 pairs of eyes turned toward her at once. Ethan looked up slowly, irritation darkening his expression. Maya swallowed hard, gripping the tray with trembling fingers. "Sir," she said quietly, "if you sign that contract, you lose controlling ownership of your company within 90 days. Silence crashed across the room. Then Ethan's face hardened instantly. "Stay out of my office," the billionaire snapped. The silence inside the boardroom felt heavier than the rain pounding against the windows 32 floors above Chicago. Nobody moved. Nobody even reached for the coffee Maya was still holding with shaking hands. Ethan Caldwell stared at her like he could not decide whether she was insane or dangerous. Then one of the executives near the far end of the table let out a short laugh. "You have got to be kidding me." Another smirked without even looking up from his tablet. "Since when does housekeeping review merger contracts?" A few low chuckles spread around the room, nervous and sharp, the kind people used when they wanted to stay on the billionaire's good side. Maya felt heat rise into her cheeks, but she did not lower her eyes. Not this time. Ethan stepped away from the table slowly, jaw tight. "Who gave you permission to walk in here?" he asked coldly. "Nobody, sir," Maya answered quietly. "I was cleaning outside, and I saw the liability clause." "You saw it?" one board member interrupted. "Do you even know what a liability clause is?" More laughter. Ethan did not laugh. That was somehow worse. He simply looked exhausted, irritated, like a man already carrying too much pressure to tolerate another problem. Behind him, the red stock ticker mounted across the far wall suddenly shifted again. Caldwell Holdings dropped another 3 points in after-hours trading. The room immediately stiffened. Phones buzzed. Analysts exchanged uneasy looks. Something about the merger leak was spreading fast across the market. Maya swallowed hard. She knew she should stop talking. She should apologize, leave the room, and disappear back into the quiet world of mops, elevators, and service hallways where people like her belonged in buildings like this. But the contract sitting on that table kept pulling at her mind. It was wrong, deliberately wrong. "Sir," she said carefully, "that clause does not just transfer legal exposure. It transfers operational authority after the acquisition closes. Whoever drafted it hid the language inside the compliance revisions." This time the laughter stopped completely. Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly. "What exactly are you saying?" Maya set the coffee tray down slowly before her hands. Dropped it entirely. "I am saying someone made it look like a standard merger protection clause, but it is not. Once the 90-day review period begins, Vance Capital can legally claim controlling influence over Caldwell Holdings if market instability occurs." A younger attorney blinked hard and grabbed the contract from beside Ethan. "That is not possible." Maya pointed carefully toward the lower paragraph near the signature page. Page 19. Section 4, subsection C. The attorney flipped pages quickly. Around him, several others leaned closer. Ethan remained completely still. Maya could feel every eye in the room on her now, weighing her, questioning her, trying to understand how a black maid in a faded housekeeping uniform was speaking the language of corporate law better than half the executives at the table. One of the senior partners finally scoffed. "This is ridiculous. She probably heard something online and is repeating it." But the younger attorney had gone pale. His eyes moved faster across the page the longer he read. Then he looked up toward Ethan with visible tension tightening his face. "Sir." The room fell silent again. Outside the glass walls, lightning flickered faintly over the dark lake. Ethan walked forward slowly and took the contract from the attorney's hands himself. Maya watched his expression carefully as his eyes scanned the paragraph. Once, twice. Then his fingers tightened slightly against the paper. The shift was almost invisible, but she saw it immediately. So did everyone else in the room. Ethan Caldwell was no longer angry. He was alarmed. Across the table, Chief Financial Officer Richard Vance adjusted his tie and forced a smile that looked just a little too quick. "Ethan," he said smoothly, "I think we are overreacting to an interpretation from a maintenance worker." Ethan did not answer right away. His eyes remained locked on the contract while the storm outside deepened over Chicago. Then finally, very slowly, he looked up from the page and toward Richard Vance. Richard Vance smiled the way powerful men smiled when they believed money could smooth over panic. Calm, polished, controlled, but a thin layer of sweat had started forming near his temples beneath the bright boardroom lights, and Ethan Caldwell noticed it immediately. The billionaire lowered the contract slowly onto the conference table without taking his eyes off his chief financial officer. Nobody else in the room dared to speak. Even the air conditioning seemed louder now, humming softly above the frozen silence. "Explain this clause to me." Ethan said at last, his voice low and dangerously calm. Richard adjusted his cufflinks before answering. It is standard merger language. Protective measures in case of market volatility. Ethan did not blink. Then why is my legal team suddenly looking like someone just pulled a fire alarm? Several attorneys avoided eye contact. One older executive quietly loosened his tie. Across the room, Maya remained near the doorway beside her abandoned cleaning cart, trying to disappear again now that the attention had shifted away from her. But Ethan noticed her too. For the first time since she walked into the room, he was no longer looking at her with irritation. He was studying her, carefully, like he was trying to solve a puzzle he did not like. You, Ethan said suddenly. Maya straightened slightly. Sir, how do you know this kind of contract language? The room turned toward her again. Maya hesitated. Questions like that always carried danger. People stopped seeing a maid the second she sounded too educated. And when people with power became uncomfortable, they usually protected themselves first. I studied business law before my mother got sick, she answered quietly. At Northwestern. A few stunned expressions flashed around the table instantly. Someone actually laughed in disbelief. Northwestern? One executive repeated. You expect us to believe that? Maya ignored him. Ethan did not. His eyes narrowed slightly as he looked at her faded housekeeping uniform, the cleaning gloves tucked into her back pocket, the exhaustion sitting beneath her eyes. Nothing about her matched the image in his mind of someone trained to dissect merger contracts. Yet she had identified a hidden takeover clause faster than his own legal department. Ethan glanced back toward Richard. Did you review this language personally? Richard forced another smile. Of course I did. Then why did my maid catch a risk worth billions of dollars before you did? The word maid hung heavily in the room. Maya lowered her gaze slightly. Richard's expression tightened for only half a second before smoothing over again. Ethan, with respect, we are under pressure right now. The market leak has everyone paranoid. Answer the question. The sharpness in Ethan's voice sliced cleanly through the room. Outside the glass windows, thunder rolled somewhere over the lake. Richard leaned forward slowly. You are letting a maintenance employee derail a $10 billion merger because she recognized legal terminology from college classes she probably never finished. Maya felt that one land hard, not because it was entirely false, but because people like Richard always knew exactly how to make unfinished dreams sound like personal failures. She swallowed quietly and looked down at the polished floor. Ethan noticed that too. For several long seconds, nobody moved. Then the young attorney, still holding the duplicate contract, cleared his throat nervously. Sir, there is something else. Every head turned toward him. He adjusted his glasses with trembling fingers. The clause references a secondary authorization signature tied to internal executive approval. Ethan frowned slightly. Meaning? The attorney hesitated. Meaning someone from inside Caldwell Holdings had to approve the transfer language before it reached the final draft. The room changed instantly. The tension no longer felt corporate. It felt personal. Ethan slowly looked around the boardroom, table one face at a time. Executives shifted uncomfortably beneath his stare. Nobody spoke. Nobody even touched their phones anymore. Then Ethan's eyes returned to Richard Vance. This time, Richard did not smile at all. Maya felt her pulse quicken again as the storm outside darkened the city skyline. Deep down, she realized something terrifying. She had not just interrupted a merger tonight. She had stepped directly into a betrayal happening inside one of the most powerful companies in Chicago. The boardroom no longer felt like a place where business deals happened. It felt like a courtroom moments before a verdict. Rain streaked down the massive windows overlooking downtown Chicago, while silence pressed heavily against every person seated around the table. Ethan Caldwell stood perfectly still near the head chair, one hand resting against the contract that suddenly looked less like paperwork and more like a loaded weapon. Across from him, Richard Vance maintained his posture carefully, but the confidence he carried earlier had begun to crack around the edges. Maya could see it now. Tiny things. The stiffness in his shoulders. The way his thumb rubbed anxiously against his wedding ring. The quick glances toward the exit doors. People revealed themselves when pressure arrived. Ethan slowly closed the contract folder. The sound echoed sharply through the room. Nobody leaves, he said calmly. Several executives exchanged uneasy looks. One woman quietly locked her phone screen and set it face down beside her water glass. The younger attorney swallowed hard before speaking again. Sir, the authorization code attached to the clause originated internally 6 days ago. Ethan looked toward him. Can you trace it? Yes, but it will take time. Richard leaned back in his chair with forced composure. Ethan, this is becoming irrational. We are delaying a merger because of assumptions built around one paragraph and a janitor who overheard a conversation she did not understand. Maya felt the sting immediately. Janitor. Not her name. Not her education. Not the fact she may have just saved the company. Just another reminder of where people believed she belonged. Ethan glanced toward her briefly. She understood it better than everyone in this room. The sentence landed hard. Nobody spoke afterward. Maya herself looked slightly startled. It was the first thing Ethan Caldwell had said all night that sounded remotely close to respect. But Richard recovered quickly. Men like him always did. You are emotional right now, Richard said smoothly. The market leak has everybody nervous. That does not mean there is a conspiracy happening inside your company. Ethan's eyes hardened. Funny choice of words. Richard's jaw tightened slightly. What is that supposed to mean? Ethan walked slowly around the conference table now, not rushing, his expensive leather shoes crossing the polished floor with soft measured steps. It means my company's secrets leaked 2 hours before signing. Another step. It means my stock suddenly starts dropping after market close. Another step. And now I find hidden transfer language buried in a contract my own chief financial officer approved. Nobody breathed. Maya stood frozen near the doorway, watching the shift happen in real time. The billionaire who walked into this room focused only on profit was becoming something else now. Suspicious. Alert. Personal. Richard stood carefully from his chair. You are accusing me because a maid pointed at legal terminology she barely understands. No, Ethan replied quietly. I am accusing you because you are sweating through a $7,500 suit. The room fell dead silent. Richard opened his mouth, then stopped. Across the skyline, lightning flashed again, reflecting briefly across the glass walls and chrome surfaces inside the boardroom. Maya noticed several executives subtly leaning away from Richard now, like instinct was beginning to separate them from danger. The younger attorney suddenly looked down at his laptop again, fingers moving quickly across the keyboard. Then his face changed completely. Pale, tight, alarmed. Sir. Ethan turned immediately. What? The attorney looked directly toward Richard this time. The authorization code came from his executive credentials. A sharp silence swallowed the room whole. Nobody moved. Richard's expression finally cracked for real. Just for a second. But Ethan saw it. Maya saw it too. And in that instant, the entire boardroom understood the same terrifying truth. The betrayal had been sitting at the table with them the whole night. Richard Vance stared at the attorney like the young man had suddenly started speaking another language. For a brief moment, nobody in the boardroom moved at all. The city lights outside shimmered through rain-streaked glass while thunder rolled low over Lake Michigan, distant but heavy enough to vibrate faintly beneath the silence. Then Richard laughed once. Sharp. Forced. That is impossible. The attorney swallowed nervously and turned the laptop screen toward Ethan Caldwell. The authorization trail links directly to Mr. Vance's executive login credentials and biometric approval. Ethan looked down at the screen without expression. Maya could not see the details from where she stood near the doorway, but she did not need to. The shift in the room told her everything. Executives who had mocked her minutes ago now looked pale and deeply uncomfortable. Some stared at Richard. Others avoided eye contact entirely. Nobody laughed anymore. Richard stepped forward carefully. Ethan, listen to me. Somebody could have accessed my credentials. Ethan finally looked up from the laptop. Calm. Cold. Dangerous. Then give me one good reason why the hidden transfer clause benefits you financially after the merger closes. Richard's mouth opened slightly, but no answer came immediately. That hesitation changed everything. Maya felt it happen in the room, like pressure dropping before a storm breaks. Trust collapsing in real time. Ethan handed the laptop back to the attorney slowly. Suspend the signing process. One of the board members immediately protested. Ethan, if this leaks publicly tomorrow morning, the market reaction could destroy us. If we sign tonight, Ethan replied quietly, there may not be a company left to protect. Silence again. Heavy. Suffocating. Maya lowered her eyes, trying to become invisible once more now that the truth had surfaced. She should not have still been standing there. This was billionaire territory. Corporate war territory. People like her were not supposed to witness moments like this. But before she could quietly step backward toward the door, Ethan spoke again. Maya. She froze. Every face turned toward her one more time. Yes, sir. Ethan studied her for several long seconds, his expression unreadable now. No anger. No mockery. Just calculation mixed with something unfamiliar. Respect, maybe. Or regret. How long did it take you to spot the claws? Maya hesitated. About 30 seconds. A stunned silence swept across the room. One executive actually cursed under his breath. Ethan looked around slowly at the expensive lawyers, analysts, and executives seated at the massive walnut table. 30 seconds, he repeated quietly. Nobody defended themselves. Nobody even tried. The humiliation sitting over the room had shifted direction completely now. Earlier that night, Maya Brooks had been the embarrassment standing in a housekeeping uniform with trembling hands and worn sneakers. Now the embarrassment belonged to every powerful person who missed what she caught instantly. Richard's face darkened. This is absurd, he snapped suddenly. We are standing here taking strategic advice from a maid because she memorized a few legal phrases years ago. Maya felt the sting immediately, but Ethan answered before she could lower her head again. No, the billionaire said calmly. We are standing here because my maid cared more about this company than my own chief financial officer. The words landed like a hammer. Richard's face went pale with anger. Several executives shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. Maya herself looked stunned. Nobody had defended her like that before inside this building. Not once. Ethan walked toward the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the stormy Chicago skyline, hands resting at his sides while lightning flickered faintly across the glass. Do you know what the funny part is? He said quietly without turning around. Nobody answered. I built this company believing power made people loyal. His reflection stared back at him in the darkened window. Turns out the only honest person in this room was the woman cleaning it. Maya looked down instantly, emotions tightening unexpectedly in her chest. Across the table, Richard Vance grabbed his briefcase sharply. I want legal representation before this goes any further. Ethan turned slowly from the window. His blue eyes looked colder now than they had all night. Sit down, Richard. For the first time since Maya entered the boardroom, Richard Vance actually looked afraid. Nobody argued after Ethan Caldwell told Richard Vance to sit down. The tension inside the boardroom had become too heavy for pride now. Too real. Richard slowly lowered himself back into the leather chair, but the confidence he carried earlier was gone completely. His hands stayed clasped tightly together on the table while the attorneys whispered quietly among themselves near the far wall. Outside, the storm continued washing over downtown Chicago, streaks of rain sliding down the glass windows like blurred silver lines beneath the city lights. Maya remained standing near the doorway beside her cleaning cart, unsure what she was supposed to do now. Her pulse still had not settled. She could feel it in her fingertips, in the tightness behind her ribs, in the ache forming across her shoulders after hours on her feet. Part of her wanted to leave before anyone remembered she did not belong there. But another part of her could not stop watching the collapse unfolding in front of her. Ethan stood near the windows silently for a long time. The billionaire looked different now. Smaller somehow. Not weaker. Just tired in a way expensive suits and corner offices could not hide anymore. The reflection staring back at him from the dark glass no longer looked like a man in control of everything. It looked like a man realizing how close he came to losing everything. Cancel tomorrow morning's press conference, he said quietly without turning around. One of his assistants nodded immediately and rushed toward the door with a phone pressed to his ear. The room stayed silent afterward except for the soft tapping of rain against the windows and the low hum of electronics. Maya slowly bent down to pick up the untouched coffee tray she abandoned earlier. The cups had gone cold hours ago. Her movements were careful again. Small. Invisible. Familiar. Ethan noticed. He turned slightly from the window, watching her gather the cups while billion-dollar conversations still hung in the air around them. Something about that image seemed to bother him deeply. A woman smart enough to save his company was quietly cleaning up after the people who almost destroyed it. One of the attorneys approached Ethan cautiously. Sir, we should notify federal investigators before the market opens. Ethan nodded once. Do it, Richard. immediately looked up. Ethan, you are making a mistake. Ethan's face hardened again. No, my mistake happened when I trusted you. Richard leaned forward desperately now, his polished executive mask finally breaking apart completely. You do not understand the pressure we were under. The shareholders wanted growth. The board wanted expansion. Vance Capital guaranteed stability. At the cost of my company. At the cost of control, Richard corrected sharply. You still would have been wealthy. Ethan let out a humorless laugh. You think this was about money? Nobody answered. Maya glanced up briefly, then quickly lowered her eyes again. Ethan noticed that too. The billionaire slowly walked back toward the conference table, loosening his tie for the first time all night. I built Caldwell Holdings from a rented warehouse with 6 employees and 2 delivery trucks, he said quietly. I missed birthdays, holidays, relationships. I worked until my hands shook from exhaustion because I believed loyalty mattered. His eyes drifted briefly toward Maya, standing quietly near the doorway. Turns out I was looking for loyalty in the wrong people. The room fell silent again. Richard looked away first. Maya carefully lifted the tray against her hip and moved toward the exit. She did not want attention anymore. She had already stepped too far into a world that punished people like her for being seen. But just before she reached the door, Ethan spoke again. Softer this time. Maya. She stopped immediately. Yes, sir. Ethan looked at her for several seconds before speaking. What happened after Northwestern? The question caught her completely off guard. She hesitated. Nobody in rooms like this usually asked what happened to people like her afterward. My mother got sick, she answered quietly. Stage 4 kidney disease. I left school during my final year. Ethan's expression shifted slightly. Not pity. Something heavier. Understanding maybe. Maya tightened her grip on the tray. Bills do not stop just because dreams do, sir. The room went completely still after that. Even Richard said nothing. Ethan looked down at the merger contract sitting open across the conference table, then back at the woman standing in a housekeeping uniform under the cold boardroom lights. For the first time all night, the billionaire looked ashamed. The boardroom slowly emptied after midnight, but the tension remained behind like smoke after a fire. Attorneys carried laptops and folders out into the hallway with tight faces and hurried steps, while security quietly escorted Richard Vance toward a private conference office downstairs. Nobody spoke loudly anymore. Nobody joked. The storm outside had softened into steady rain, and downtown Chicago glowed beneath wet streets and blurred headlights far below the tower windows. Maya stood alone near the service elevator, holding her empty coffee tray against her chest, waiting for the floor to clear before finishing the cleaning she never got to complete. Her body ached from exhaustion. Her feet burned inside worn sneakers after a double shift. And somewhere across the city, her mother was probably awake in their small apartment, waiting for Maya's text saying she was finally coming home. The 32nd floor had gone strangely quiet now. Cold. Still. The kind of silence expensive buildings carried late at night after power conversations ended, and only janitors remained behind to erase the evidence people were ever there at all. Maya slowly pushed her cleaning cart back into the boardroom. Half-empty water glasses sat abandoned across the conference table beside scattered legal documents and fingerprints smudged across polished wood. The skyline shimmered beyond the windows while rainwater traced slow silver paths down the glass. She began cleaning quietly, the same way she always did. Wipe the table. Stack the papers. Empty the cups. Invisible work. Honest work. Yet tonight, everything felt different somehow. The room no longer looked untouchable. It looked fragile. Human. Maya reached for one of the folders near Ethan Caldwell's chair when a voice behind her broke the silence softly. You missed one. She turned quickly. Ethan stood near the doorway alone now. Jacket removed, tie loosened, exhaustion written clearly across his face. Without the crowd around him, he looked older than he had earlier. That night, less like a billionaire, more like a man carrying too much weight for too long. Maya immediately straightened. Sorry, sir. Ethan walked toward the conference table slowly and picked up a loose contract page she had not seen near the floor. You do not have to apologize every time you breathe in this building. The sentence caught her off guard. She looked down quietly, unsure how to answer. Ethan studied her for a moment before placing the paper carefully onto the table. You saved me tonight. Maya shook her head gently. I just noticed something was wrong. My own executive board did not notice. His voice carried no anger now, only disappointment. Maya stayed silent. Ethan leaned lightly against the edge of the conference table, staring out toward the rain-covered skyline. "Do you know what the worst part is?" he asked quietly. Maya looked up slightly. "Sir, I almost ignored you because of the uniform you were wearing." The honesty in his voice settled heavily between them. Maya tightened her grip on the cleaning cloth in her hands. She had heard comments like that her whole life, but almost never spoken out loud by the people thinking them. Ethan let out a slow breath. "You walked into that room trying to help me, and my first instinct was to throw you out." Maya looked toward the windows where lightning flickered faintly far above the lake. "People see what they expect to see," she said softly. Ethan looked at her carefully then. "And what am I supposed to see now?" The question lingered quietly between them. Maya hesitated before answering. "Just a woman trying to keep her mother alive." Ethan lowered his eyes briefly. The polished boardroom around them suddenly felt painfully small compared to the truth sitting inside that sentence. For several long moments, neither spoke. The rain continued tapping softly against the glass while the city lights shimmered below like reflections in dark water. Then Ethan reached into his jacket resting on the chair and pulled out a business card. He placed it carefully on the conference table between them. "Tomorrow morning," he said quietly, "I want you upstairs on the executive floor." Maya stared at the card without touching it. "Sir, I clean the executive floor." Ethan shook his head once. "No, Maya." His voice softened slightly. "Tomorrow, you walk in through the front doors." The next morning, Caldwell Holdings felt like an entirely different building. News of the suspended merger had already spread through Chicago's financial district before sunrise. Employees whispered in elevators. Executives moved through hallways with strained expressions and lowered voices. Several television screens inside the lobby displayed stock analysts discussing internal instability at Caldwell Holdings while scrolling headlines flashed across the bottom of the screen. Yet through all the noise, Maya Brooks almost turned around 3 separate times before reaching the front entrance. She stood across the street from the 70-story glass tower wearing the only professional outfit she still owned from college. A charcoal gray blazer, slightly outdated at the shoulders. Black slacks pressed carefully the night before. Her hair pulled back neatly. In one hand, she held Ethan Caldwell's business card. In the other, her train pass and a paper cup of coffee that had already gone cold in the November air. She stared up at the building for several long seconds. Just yesterday, she entered through the employee service entrance downstairs beside loading docks and maintenance elevators. Today, the revolving front doors reflected her uncertain expression back at her beneath polished brass and morning sunlight. "You belong here," she whispered softly to herself, though even she did not fully believe it yet. Inside the lobby, conversation slowed almost immediately when she walked through the front entrance. A few employees recognized her instantly from the boardroom rumors already spreading through the company overnight. Some looked surprised, others curious. One older security guard near the reception desk gave her a small, respectful nod instead of asking for her maintenance badge. That tiny gesture almost made her emotional. Maya approached the executive elevators carefully, trying to ignore the pounding in her chest. Before she could press the button, a familiar voice spoke behind her. "Miss Brooks." She turned quickly. It was Claire Monroe, Ethan Caldwell's executive assistant, dressed sharply in a navy suit while holding a digital tablet against her arm. Unlike most people in the building, Claire's expression carried no judgment, only professionalism. "Mr. Caldwell is waiting for you upstairs." Maya nodded quietly. "Thank you." The elevator ride to the executive floor felt longer than usual. Soft piano music drifted through hidden speakers while Chicago's skyline expanded beneath the rising morning sun outside the glass walls. Maya stared at her reflection in the mirrored elevator panels, trying not to think about how out of place she still felt. When the doors finally opened onto the top executive floor, everything looked exactly the same as yesterday and completely different at the same time. The marble floors still gleamed beneath warm lighting. Floor-to-ceiling windows still overlooked the city. Assistants still hurried between offices carrying tablets and coffee cups. Yet now people looked at her directly instead of through her. Ethan Caldwell stood near the far conference room windows with his back partially turned when she entered. He was already dressed for work again in a dark tailored suit, but something about him looked quieter today, less armored. He turned as Maya approached slowly. You came. Maya held the business card carefully between her fingers. I almost did not. Ethan gave a faint nod like he understood exactly why. Sit down, he said gently, motioning toward the conference chair nearest the windows. Maya hesitated before sitting carefully at the massive table where executives usually negotiated billion-dollar deals. Yesterday, she had stood outside this room, holding a mop bucket. The difference almost felt unreal. Ethan placed a folder in front of her. I spent most of the night reviewing your academic records. Maya looked up sharply, surprised. Ethan continued calmly. Northwestern Law. Top 5% of your class, before withdrawal. Maya lowered her eyes slightly. Hearing those words out loud after years of silence around that part of her life felt strangely painful. Ethan rested his hands lightly against the table. You should have never ended up cleaning floors in this building. Maya looked back at him quietly. Life does not ask people what they deserve, Mr. Caldwell. Ethan exhaled slowly at that. Then he pushed the folder toward her. Inside sat a formal employment offer stamped with the Caldwell Holdings executive seal. Junior contract risk analyst. Full salary. Full benefits. Tuition reimbursement. Maya stared at the page silently while morning light spilled across the table between them. Why? She asked softly after a long moment. Ethan looked at her carefully. Because yesterday the smartest person in my company was the only one nobody bothered listening to. 3 months later, the 32nd floor of Caldwell Holdings looked exactly the same to most people. The marbles still gleamed beneath warm lighting. Assistants still hurried between conference rooms carrying tablets and coffee cups. Executives still negotiated numbers large enough to change markets before lunch. But for Maya Brooks, everything had changed. The morning sunlight spilled across the Chicago skyline as she stepped out of the executive elevator wearing a tailored charcoal suit and a company identification badge that no longer read housekeeping services beneath her name. Now it read contract risk analyst. The silver lettering still felt unreal every time she saw it. Maya walked through the hallway calmly with a leather portfolio tucked beneath her arm, while employees greeted her with respectful nods instead of distracted silence. At first, the attention had made her uncomfortable. Weeks earlier, she cleaned fingerprints from these same glass walls while people walked past her like she was part of the furniture. Now attorneys stopped asking for second opinions until Maya reviewed the contracts herself. It still amazed her sometimes how quickly the world changed once people decided your intelligence mattered. Inside the boardroom, executives slowly settled into their seats for the quarterly restructuring meeting. Some of the faces were new after the federal investigation surrounding Richard Vance triggered resignations across several departments. Others remained the same, though quieter. Now, whenever Maya entered the room, nobody laughed anymore. Nobody made comments about housekeeping uniforms or janitors reading contracts. Ethan Caldwell stood near the windows overlooking downtown Chicago, reviewing documents while early sunlight reflected against the glass towers outside. He looked different these days, too. Still sharp, still intimidating, but less distant somehow. The hard edges around him had softened in ways most employees quietly noticed, but rarely discussed aloud. Maya reached her chair near the middle of the conference table and carefully set down her portfolio. For half a second, her eyes drifted toward the exact spot near the doorway where she once stood holding a tray of cold coffee with trembling hands while powerful people mocked her existence. The memory still lived there quietly inside her. Not as pain anymore, as proof. Ethan looked up from his notes as the room settled. Their eyes met briefly across the table. No grand speech passed between them. No dramatic moment. Just a small nod from the billionaire that carried something simple and honest inside it. Respect. The meeting began. Financial forecasts. Expansion proposals. Legal reviews. The normal language of billion-dollar companies moving through another morning in America. Yet halfway through the meeting, one senior executive hesitated over a revised acquisition document before sliding it carefully toward Maya. Could you take a look at Section 12 before we finalize this? He asked. The room stayed quiet while Maya reviewed the pages calmly beneath the sunlight spilling across polished walnut and chrome. She noticed Ethan watching her briefly before returning to his own notes with the faintest trace of a smile near the corner of his mouth. Not pride exactly. Relief maybe. Like a man finally learning the difference between power and worth. Maya finished reading and offered a small correction regarding the indemnity language. 2 attorneys immediately adjusted their copies. Nobody questioned her. Nobody doubted her. Outside the windows, Chicago moved endlessly beneath the morning light, while traffic crawled through rain-washed streets far below the tower. Maya leaned back, slightly in her chair as conversation continued around the table. For the first time in years, she did not feel invisible. Not because she wore a better suit now, not because she sat in a different chair, but because someone finally listened before it was too late. Near the end of the meeting, Ethan closed his folder and looked around the room quietly. "Before we adjourn," he said calmly, "there is one thing I want everybody here to remember." The room stilled immediately. Ethan glanced briefly toward Maya before speaking. "Never underestimate the person the world taught itself not to see." Silence settled softly across the boardroom afterward. Not awkward silence. Not fearful silence. Something quieter. Something heavier. The kind that only appears when people realize they witnessed the truth too late to deny it. Beyond the windows, sunlight reflected across the city skyline, while Maya Brooks lowered her eyes toward the contract resting open in front of her. The same kind of document that once almost destroyed a company until a Blackmaid refused to stay silent.